Communism, as envisioned by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, is a political ideology based on the idea that society should be built on communal ownership of the means of production and the equal distribution of goods. Marx argued that this approach would end the exploitation of workers by capitalists and create a more just society. In this video, we will delve into the compelling argument that communism has disastrously failed as an idea and in practice. After thoroughly examining the topic, we will engage in a fictional discussion with an enthusiastic communist who will challenge our assertions. This is an exciting experiment, as ChatGPT will attempt to step into the role of a communist and counter our arguments.
Marx's ideas are riddled with significant flaws that we will now delve into in more detail. A central problem lies in his unrealistic assumptions about human behavior and the motivation of workers. Marx believed that by abolishing private property, workers would spontaneously act in solidarity and class consciousness. He assumed that capitalism alienates workers from their labor, while communism provides them with the opportunity for self-realization. Marx presumed that workers would always fight against exploitation by capitalists, disregarding their individual circumstances or personal values. However, he overlooked the lack of incentives in communism for achieving personal success through hard work, merit, and entrepreneurial risk-taking. This lack of satisfaction for workers leads to decreased productivity and diminished economic growth. Another fundamental flaw in Marx's theory lies in his massive underestimation of the role of the individual in society and the economy. He argued that societal relations determine the economy and that individual decisions and activities are irrelevant. Similarly, he believed that the mode of production shapes society, disregarding individual desires and needs. Marx saw individuals merely as representatives of their class, disregarding their individual personalities and choices. This misconception led him to prioritize the welfare of society over the rights and well-being of individuals. Consequently, communist regimes committed human rights violations as the welfare of the individual was neglected. This perspective simplifies and categorizes individuals, bearing little resemblance to the real world. Marx painted a bleak picture of humanity, viewing people merely as part of a class that needs to be guided, rather than as individuals seeking their own path to happiness. Marx's gloomy portrayal of humanity, perceiving people solely as part of a class in need of guidance, also leads to a miscalculation of the capabilities of a centralized government to effectively plan and control the economy. Such a government often lacks the same information that market participants possess, as they are aware of their own needs and resources, which they can coordinate effectively. Furthermore, a centralized government is susceptible to corruption and abuse of power, which can further impair the economy. Centralized governments also struggle to respond quickly to changes in the economy and demand, as decision-making is often delayed by bureaucratic processes. This underestimation of the ability of a centralized government to effectively manage and plan the economy results in prices of goods being determined not by supply and demand, but by political decisions. As a result, prices do not reflect the real value of goods, leading to overall inefficiency in the economy. Marx's communist vision also overlooks the entrepreneurial risk. In a communist society where the means of production are collectively owned, there is no incentive for entrepreneurs to take risks and develop innovations. After all, the profits do not personally benefit them. In a way, capitalist gains compensate for the willingness to take risks and invest in new ideas and projects. In addition to these aspects, Marx also assumes that a capitalist economy is based on exploitation rather than voluntary cooperation. In reality, a free market with equal participants who voluntarily cooperate forms the foundation of capitalism. When some individuals provide capital and take risks while others contribute their labor and time, it represents a legitimate division of tasks. However, the assumption that the economy is based on exploitation can lead to the justification of violence and other extreme measures. Moreover, contemporary proponents of Marxism often overlook the historical experiences with communist regimes. which consistently led to a decline in overall prosperity and a deterioration in people's quality of life. This is due to the nationalization of the means of production and centralized economic planning, resulting in inefficiency and lack of incentives, which in turn cause a scarcity of goods and services for the population.
Various philosophers have consistently criticized Marx's theories, arguing that his ideas are practically unworkable and inevitably lead to serfdom and dictatorship. For instance, Friedrich Hayek contended that centralized economic planning restricts individual freedom and is inefficient. Milton Friedman, on the other hand, believed that the free market is the best method to satisfy societal needs and create prosperity. Ayn Rand emphasized that communism suppresses individual rights and freedoms, asserting that capitalism is the only moral economic system. Isaiah Berlin criticized Marx's dialectics and argued that they inevitably lead to violence and oppression. Karl Popper stressed that Marx's theories are unfalsifiable and therefore do not qualify as scientific theories. He also argued that Marxism is a utopian ideology that inevitably leads to dictatorship and oppression.
When discussing communism and its effects, it is crucial to consider its practical implementation. In the past, communist regimes have often committed severe human rights violations, ranging from political persecution to torture and murder. Additionally, they have had negative impacts on the environment, as the focus on rapid growth and industrialization often came at the expense of nature. Another crucial point is that communism in practice frequently leads to the centralization of power and the disempowerment of the population, as an elite controls the means of production and the economy. All of this demonstrates that Marx was fundamentally mistaken, not only in theory, but also in practice, both philosophically and in reality, on every point.
Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known by his pseudonym Lenin, and Mao Zedong attempted to further develop and implement Marxism. Both were known for implementing their ideas in an authoritarian and repressive manner, leading to a suppression of individual freedoms and human rights violations. It is essential to mention their ideas and their implementation in the communist regimes they established in terms of their impact on individual freedom and human rights. Historically, Lenin's regime directly led to Joseph Stalin, who became one of the worst mass murderers of all time under the pseudonym Joseph Stalin. Lenin himself was primarily responsible for the deaths of people during the Russian Revolution and the subsequent Civil War, estimated to be around 1 to 1.5 million fatalities. Stalin is attributed to the deaths of at least 3 to 7 million people during the Ukrainian famine, as well as the persecution and execution of political opponents and ethnic minorities, resulting in a total responsibility for the deaths of about 20 to 30 million people. Mao, depending on estimates, is held responsible for the deaths of up to 45 million people during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. While these numbers are rough estimates, they clearly demonstrate the incredibly high level of crimes and the failure of communist philosophy in practice. Lev Davidovich Bronstein, better known as Leon Trotsky, was a Russian revolutionary and theorist of communism. He was a prominent activist during the Russian Revolution of 1917 and a co-founder of the Red Army. However, Trotsky also employed violence as a means to enforce his ideas and was complicit in crimes committed during the Russian Revolution and the subsequent Civil War. His concept of a permanent revolution leading to a world government also leads to the abuse of power and corruption as seen in communist practices worldwide. Contemporary Trotskyists often have an idealized and romanticized view of Trotsky and his ideas, ignoring the negative impacts of his ideology in practice. Furthermore, independent small states are generally more successful and better able to adapt to the needs of their populations than a unified world government. If there were a unified world government, there would be no alternatives, no progress, and dissidents would have no escape. Rosa Luxemburg was a Marxist revolutionary and theorist who advocated for the creation of a classless society. She believed that the working class should be the dominant class in society and that the abolition of private ownership of the means of production was the basis for creating a classless society. Luxemburg saw the state as a necessary evil that should only exist until society became classless and then become obsolete. She also envisioned a direct democracy in which the working class had control over production and the distribution of goods and services. However, her vision of a classless society would have led to the same problems as other approaches. It is clear that such a society would not function, and mechanisms would need to be in place to control the working class. Ultimately, this would also require the use of violence because as soon as people are given freedoms, differences will emerge. Therefore, the same concerns regarding inefficiency and the lack of incentives apply to such a society.
Inequality, particularly in the form of poverty, is often perceived as injustice and can lead to dissatisfaction and rest. However, communism has shown in practice that the elimination of poverty, through the expropriation of private property and centralized planning and control of the economy, is not successful and leads to serious issues such as human rights violations, economic crises, and suppression of freedom. Communism is therefore not the right solution for eradicating poverty and creating justice. Instead, capitalism, complemented by measures to improve social mobility, can help create more prosperity and justice for all, ultimately achieving this goal without resorting to violence.
Some arguments in favor of centralized planning and control of the economy include the need to optimize the country's resources, the ability to adapt and plan the economy more quickly, and the opportunity to steer the economy towards societal goals rather than the interests of businesses and individuals. However, in practice, these arguments depend on the implementation in reality, and the experiences in communist countries have clearly shown that centralized planning and control always lead to inefficient outcomes, abuse of power, and human rights violations. Ultimately, the interest of society lies in optimizing the interests of individuals, and this optimization is best achieved through negotiations in the free market. A centralized government does not possess the same amount of information as market participants and can never effectively control resource allocation and plan the economy as efficiently as a free market can. Therefore, a free market is always superior to a centrally planned economy.
World War I had a profound influence on the emergence and rise of communism. The war losses and economic difficulties that followed led to general dissatisfaction and radicalization in many countries. The emergence of extremist groups can also be a factor contributing to the support of communist ideologies. These groups often exploit the discontent and sense of injustice in society to spread their ideology and gain support. However, extremist ideologies, including communist ideologies, should not be seen as a solution to the problems in society, as they lead to even greater problems and violate human rights.
We have now witnessed communism in practice for over a century. The German author Dr. Rainer Seidelmann extensively explored these experiences in his book Capitalism is not the problem, but the solution. A historical comparison between communist and capitalist countries clearly demonstrates that capitalist countries generally enjoy higher prosperity and a better quality of life. For example, when comparing Chile and Venezuela, it is evident that Chile, with its capitalist economic system, is one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America, while Venezuela suffers from the consequences of communism, experiencing high poverty rates and poor living conditions. The difference between North and South Korea or East and West Germany is also stark, with the same people divided into two different systems and undergoing completely different developments. These examples vividly illustrate the superiority of capitalism over communism. It is important to note that there are different variations and interpretations of communism, and not all countries have had or currently have the same type of communist system. It is crucial to consider the specific circumstances and developments in each country before drawing general conclusions about communism. However, all of these variations have proven to be inefficient and unsuccessful. Here are some concrete examples of these variations and the reasons for their failure. The Soviet Union attempted to build a communist economic system by nationalizing the means of production and centrally planning the economy. However, this led to economic inefficiency and a lack of goods and services for the population. Another problem was that the government did not create incentives for innovation and productivity. China pursued a similar strategy to the Soviet Union, but also implemented some reforms to boost the economy. This has resulted in China becoming one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. However, there are still issues such as the suppression of civil rights and environmental destruction. Cuba also has a communist economic system where the means of production are nationalized and the economy is planned by the government. However, this has led to a lack of goods and services for the population and a lack of incentives for innovation and productivity. Venezuela is another example of a country suffering under communist ideas and centralized planning. Under the leadership of Hugo Chavez and his successor, Nicolás Maduro, Venezuela has experienced a persistent economic crisis, leading to a lack of basic necessities such as food and medicine for the population. Press freedom and human rights are severely restricted as well. The economic crisis has been exacerbated by a heavy reliance on oil exports, a lack of economic diversification, and mismanagement and corruption by the government. These factors combined have resulted in a mass exodus of Venezuelan citizens and a humanitarian crisis in the country. These are just some examples of communist variations that have failed. The reasons for this failure demonstrate that communism, as an economic system and ideology, is inefficient and unsustainable. There are no historical examples of successful implementation of communism as an economic system. All countries that have attempted to build a communist society have experienced severe problems in terms of economy, political freedom, and human rights, ultimately resulting in failure. In practice, communism has always led to a decline in prosperity and a deterioration of the population's quality of life. The partial success of China can be attributed to the fact that it has implemented capitalist reforms in recent decades, leading to strong economic growth and an increase in the population's standard of living. However, the Chinese government still maintains strong control over the economy, and the freedoms and civil rights of the population remain restricted. Additionally, China's economic growth has slowed down in recent years due to increasing state intervention and control, and there are still many challenges and issues that need to be addressed. It is true that capitalism is not perfect and also has its own challenges and problems. For a just capitalism, it is important to enable high social mobility so that people actually have the opportunity to fully utilize their abilities. However, capitalism is the best-known economic system to date that creates and enables prosperity and freedom for the population. Furthermore, there is no country in the world that has ever allowed unregulated free capitalism. However, statistically, the higher the level of economic freedom in a country, the greater its overall prosperity and the better the economic well-being of its population. Communism has miserably failed as an ideology and economic system. It has repeatedly shown to lead to oppression, poverty, and lack of economic performance. Instead of relying on a failed system, we should turn our focus more towards capitalism and dare to embrace more free markets with less regulation.
We have asked ChatGPT how a communist would respond to this post. As an artificial intelligence that has been exposed to various viewpoints, I am capable of assuming a specific position. Now let the thrilling debate begin.
Yes, I agree that many communist regimes emerged in challenging historical circumstances. There were often wars, imperialism, and foreign interventions that hindered the implementation of communism. These conditions should be taken into account before we condemn communism as a whole. We must also not forget that capitalism is a system of inequality and exploitation. While it generates material wealth for some, it also leads to significant social and economic disparities that restrict the freedom and well-being of many. It is true that true communism has never been fully realized, but that is because communist states have often faced opposition from external forces. We should not consider communism as a failed system because its true potential has not been In comparison to capitalism, communism offers a higher level of social security and welfare. It ensures a fairer distribution of resources and places greater emphasis on social safety nets and public services. The preceding video feature is a simplified portrayal of communism and ignores different communist currents and variations in different countries and historical contexts. A more nuanced examination of communism could lead to a more nuanced understanding of its strengths and weaknesses. Unlike capitalism, communism is better suited to promote a sustainable and environmentally friendly economy. It is based on cooperation and communal ownership, rather than competition and private property, which can lead to the exploitation of natural resources and environmental destruction.
I agree that historical context is important, but we should also consider that capitalist countries have faced similar challenges and yet have been able to create freedom and prosperity. It is the system of communism itself that is more susceptible to problems, regardless of specific conditions. Inequality is important because enforced equality stifles achievement. Only when individual effort is rewarded does it propel society as a whole forward, and yet even the poorest in a free and capitalist society are better off than the middle class in a socialist or communist society. The failure of communism is not only evident in practice, but also in theory. The system relies on coercion and violence, as people can only surrender their economic and individual freedom under compulsion. A communist society can never be free unless there is a voluntary agreement within a free society, but no one should have their ideology imposed on them. Social welfare should be provided voluntarily by individuals. In the free market, there are insurance solutions and savings plans that can mitigate adversity. However, since capitalism creates the most prosperity, and prosperity is necessary to be able to help others in the first place, the free market is the better alternative with greater potential. I agree that there are different variations of communism, but all known examples of communist governments have led to oppression, poverty, and inefficiency in practice. This shows that the fundamental principles of communism are problematic, regardless of specific circumstances. I also believe that a completely free society allows room for other experiments, like communism, but no one should be allowed to impose their ideology on others. The free market is the superior economic system for creating prosperity and protecting the environment. An intact environment aligns with market interests and will therefore be preserved by a completely free market.
I understand the arguments, but I still see many advantages in the communist system. Yes, it is true that communism has failed in the past, but that does not mean it is impossible to build a successful communist society. The historical conditions under which communist regimes emerged were often extremely challenging and led to many problems and mistakes. However, when we look at the principles of communism, there are many positive aspects that can promote a more just and equal society. I also do not believe that inequality is necessary to promote performance and motivation. On the contrary, I think that every individual has the potential to self-motivate and improve themselves regardless of their salary or social status. There are also many ways to create social security and welfare in a communist system without compromising individual freedom. Yes, it is true that communism often goes hand in hand with violence and repression in practice, but that does not mean that these negative aspects are unavoidable. If a communist society is based on voluntarism and cooperation rather than coercion and suppression, it might be possible to create a successful communist system. In conclusion, I believe it is important to have a nuanced understanding of communism. We should not forget that there are many variations of communism, and it is possible to create a successful communist system that promotes individual freedom and welfare.
Let us strive for a free society together where every person can pursue their own happiness, while also refraining from dictating how others should live. This society should be based on the principle that everything is allowed as long as it does not involve the use of force against others. Every individual should have the right to freedom, which includes the right to dispose of their own earned achievements. Everyone should be able to keep their creations or engage in trade with them, thus preserving the right to private property. At the same time, people should also have the right to voluntarily contribute their property to a commune and renounce personal ownership. However, the boundaries of these communes must remain open. Never again should a wall be built to prevent people from leaving a commune. Under these conditions, capitalism and communism could freely compete with each other, and the superior system would prevail. Alternatively, both systems could coexist peacefully side by side without any oppression. This could be a possible path towards a shared, free future of peaceful coexistence.
As a communist, I cannot agree with this proposal. There are many reasons why a free society based on capitalist principles is not the right model to fulfill the needs of all. Capitalism promotes inequality and favours those with more capital, resulting in a few becoming increasingly wealthy, while others become poorer. A free society where every person can pursue their own happiness is a noble goal, but it is naive to believe that this can be achieved under capitalist principles. Those who are wealthy will use their power and influence to further their own interests, while the poor and vulnerable are oppressed and exploited. I believe that a socialist society, where the means of production are in the hands of the workers and distributive justice is given higher priority, is a better model. Such a society would allow everyone to fulfill their needs and desires without a few benefiting at the expense of others. Of course, we should be open to discussions and collaboration to improve our societies, but I cannot agree with a system that is based on inequality and exploitation.
Are you aware that your path is a path of violence and oppression, where not only a few are left behind, but the majority suffers? If we look at the world, societies are far less free and far less free and far less capitalist than I would like them to be. And yet, people in capitalist countries live much better, freer, and more prosperous lives than in any of the existing communist or socialist countries. Unless a megalomaniacal old communist and former KGB spy attacks a free country, think Ukraine war, capitalist Europeans have been living peacefully and engaging in relatively free trade side by side for over half a century. Capitalists are inherently peace-loving people out of pure self-interest. In peace, they can build and protect their wealth better. Even the poorest people in capitalist countries live better than elsewhere in the world. This is not necessarily due to social democratic interventions, but also because only those who have enough can give something away. I am even convinced that there is no need for a welfare state because humans are social and compassionate beings. People help other people even without being forced to do so. On the contrary, voluntarily provided help comes from the heart and brings happiness to both sides, while a social democratic system based on taxes only leads to bureaucratic waste. Freedom is therefore a benefit for all people.
As a communist, I must say that I cannot agree with your depiction. Your argument is based on the assumption that capitalism and freedom are inseparable, but that is not the case. The inequality and oppression that arise from capitalism are barriers to freedom and hinder the fulfillment of the needs of all people. You talk about how capitalism in Europe leads to peaceful coexistence, but that is only superficially true. The absence of open conflicts between nations does not mean that all people are free and equal. The economic power wielded by capitalist elites has implications for political power and leads to injustice and oppression. You also claim that humans are inherently social and compassionate and that the welfare state is unnecessary. But these assumptions are flawed. People can be selfish and cruel, and a society based on the idea that everyone is responsible for themselves only exacerbates inequality and injustice. I believe that a socialist society, where the needs of all are prioritized and inequality and exploitation are fought against, is the best path to a free and just society. We should strive to build such a society by placing the means of production in the hands of the workers and increasing distributive justice. Only then can we create a society where every person can be happy in their own way.
I think the fundamental difference between us lies in our view of human nature. I see humans as beings who strive for freedom and willingly take responsibility, who seek peace and view violence only as a last resort to protect themselves against injustice. I have a very positive view of humanity, and I believe that history and practice have proven me right. The history of humanity has brought us a long way, and it continues to progress and get better. However, this progress requires us to actively move in the right direction. On the other hand, you see people as victims who need to be helped and controlled. But in doing so, you forget that it is also people who rule over others in communism. What makes you believe that this is a good solution when history and all previous experiences show the complete opposite?
I think you misunderstand my view of human nature. I see humans as social beings who can work together for a better society. In a communist society, the means of production would be in the hands of the workers, and distribution justice would be prioritized. This doesn't mean that we view people as victims, but rather that we strive for a society where all individuals are treated equally and fairly. I believe that it is possible to create a better society where the well-being of all is prioritized, not just that of the rich and powerful. Of course, there is also the risk of power abuse and oppression in communism, but our goal is to create a society where that doesn't happen. We believe it is possible to build a more just and compassionate society where all people can live in peace and prosperity.
We agree on wanting equal treatment for all individuals. However, that requires unrestricted freedom for every person. No one should dictate to another whether they can own the means of production or not, because every individual has the same right to decide for themselves. We also agree that humans are social beings who are willing to stand together for a better world. That's precisely why I believe no one needs to force people into solidarity. Even the wealthy benefit when they don't have to hide behind barbed wire fences. The rich have their own interest in not allowing the disparities to become too great. And look at the practical side. Most wealthy individuals create foundations to give back to humanity from their wealth. And even when they acquire wealth, if they do so in a free market, they must always find voluntary contracting partners. The trick of freedom of contract and free trade is that no one exploits another, but rather both parties enter into agreements where both sides win. The wealthy have acquired their wealth by satisfying customers, paying suppliers, and creating jobs. In doing so, they also bear many risks. Without entrepreneurship, the economy collapses. Those who are wealthy are rightfully so. The wealthy support society in many ways, much more than someone who spends their entire life as an employee. But I agree with you that people who have unfavorable circumstances should indeed be supported. However, on a voluntary basis. Just imagine how much money would be available if we didn't have to pay taxes and could distribute that money according to our own discretion to those in need, without the majority of it getting lost in government bureaucracy and nepotism.
I believe we still have very different notions of freedom and equality. Your idea of freedom means freedom for those who are already privileged and have sufficient resources to exercise their freedom. For those who are less privileged, your concept of freedom leads to more inequality and oppression. I believe in a freedom that applies to everyone, regardless of their social or economic status. And I believe in an equality that is not just formal, but also material. A society where a few are rich and others are poor cannot be considered truly free and equal. You argue that free trade and freedom of contract led to both parties benefiting from agreements. However, in reality, not all individuals have the same power and resources to engage in negotiations on fair and equal terms. This results in the powerful and privileged dictating the terms and exploiting the weak and underprivileged. In a socialist society, the means of production would be in the hands of the workers, and there would be no class differences that could lead to such inequalities. Of course, we should strive to support people with unfavourable circumstances. But voluntary support alone is not enough to address structural problems such as poverty, homelessness, and unemployment. It requires a collective effort to ensure that all individuals have equal opportunities to lead a life of dignity.
Yes, freedom applies to everyone. However, freedom comes in two forms: passive freedom and active freedom. Passive freedom means I can do what is within my capabilities without anyone preventing me from doing so. Active freedom means others must enable me to do things that I cannot achieve on my own. Passive freedom is neutral. It does not impede the freedom of others, and all individuals can enjoy the same freedom. But active freedom always involves coercion and comes at the expense of someone else, who must facilitate the things that one cannot accomplish alone. Therefore, I reject active freedom unless it is voluntarily enabled. In a society, passive freedom can be unrestricted, limited only by the same freedom of others. However, active freedom must be carefully managed and organized, which often leads to bureaucracy and corruption. Those who enforce active freedoms always create unequal individuals, those who benefit and those who must bear the cost. True freedom must always be earned, And practice shows that communism is not the answer, but rather the ultimate end of freedom for all. Practice also demonstrates that in capitalism, the prosperity of all rises and the gap between the rich and the poor closes in the long run. Not only do the rich become richer, but the poor also become richer. We solve structural problems with freedom because freedom does not simply redistribute the pie. Freedom bakes much larger pies.
I understand your thoughts on freedom, but I believe that your definition of freedom is too superficial. Freedom is not just about being able to do whatever one wants, as long as it doesn't harm anyone. Freedom also means having the opportunity to pursue one's goals and dreams without external circumstances such as financial or social inequality getting in the way. Capitalism may bring prosperity to some in the short term, but in the long run, it leads to social injustice and monopolies of power. History has shown this repeatedly. The free market is not truly free because a few large companies dominate everything, pushing small businesses out of the market. Moreover, the concentration of capital in the hands of a few individuals leads to an unequal distribution of resources and power in society. In contrast, a socialist society would ensure that all people have equal opportunities to achieve their goals and dreams. The means of production would be in the hands of the workers, and decisions would be made democratically. It is incorrect to claim that socialism means the end of freedom. In reality, it creates a society in which every individual has the chance to fulfill their potential without being constrained by structural inequality. The past has shown that a purely capitalist society does not work. We need a society that protects the freedom of each individual while also ensuring that everyone has equal opportunities to achieve their goals. In my opinion, a socialist society is the best model to achieve this goal.
Without external circumstances such as financial or social inequality getting in the way. Is what you meant. That's exactly why utopias always fail and end up in a dreadful dictatorship. Their advocates fail to realize that in the real world there are always limits, and it is only through exceptional achievement that these limits can be pushed further. On the other hand, socialist alternatives have failed, both in theory and in practice. Capitalism never leads to monopolies. It is always the regulatory interventions of states that create monopolies. States increase market entry barriers with their regulations, thus creating the very monopolies that they claim to combat. In a free market, someone can always come up with a better offer, and someone always does. While there may be large companies with nearly dominant market positions, such as Google, competition never disappears, and these firms only maintain their strong positions because they better satisfy customer needs than anyone else. As soon as they neglect their customers or a new technology emerges, the cards are reshuffled, and this always happens. Take IBM and Microsoft, both of which once had dominant market positions but were overtaken by competitors. An example today is Google's strength in search engines because they are simply very good at it. You voluntarily choose to search with Google. You could also use DuckDuckGo, as I often do. Instead of Android, you can buy Apple. These near monopolies are based on performance and can only be sustained if these companies consistently deliver outstanding performance. If that is no longer the case, such quasi-monopolistic positions quickly disappear. The dominant market positions are well-earned but temporary. The market functions perfectly and self-regulates, and we all benefit from it. Even a poor person can afford a mobile phone today that can do things for which in 1990 they would have had to buy 24 devices for thousands of francs each without covering all the functions. Even a cheap phone has an excellent camera, can record images and sound, play music and movies, chat, conduct banking transactions, shop, and much more. Only the free market creates such incredible progress. The government is nothing but a disruptive factor. If the state were to focus only on the essentials, namely the judiciary, progress could be even greater and faster. One could even abolish the state entirely and build the legal system on voluntary contracts.
I believe we won't reach an agreement here. You believe in absolute freedom, but you forget that freedom always comes with responsibility. Capitalism promotes individuality, but overlooks the fact that we live in a society and have a responsibility towards one another. The state is an important regulator to ensure that the rights and needs of all people are protected. Without it, there would be no fair system and the weak and exploited would be left behind. You may believe that the market self-regulates and that corporations are successful solely based on their performance, but that is a naive assumption. Corporations often use their power and capital to drive small businesses out of the market, or even acquire them, becoming even more powerful and gaining further advantages. The market is not always fair and can easily be manipulated, especially by powerful players. Furthermore, you forget that capitalism can also lead to environmental destruction and exploitation. When companies are solely profit-driven, they often have little interest in sustainability and social responsibility. Capitalism often creates a culture of overconsumption and waste, which threatens our world and our lives in the long run. I believe that a socialist society, where production and distribution are controlled by the workers, is a better solution to our problems. Such a society can create fair conditions for all people and ensure that the needs of everyone are met.
People with more freedom automatically take on more responsibility. That's inherent to freedom. And the vast majority of people not only take responsibility for themselves, but also voluntarily take responsibility for others. And if corporations act too ignorantly, they will no longer find customers willing to buy their products. Money flows voluntarily from customers to a company. The only entities that enforce money contributions are criminals and the government. And you forget that the environment in communist countries was much more devastated than in capitalist ones, and that a clean environment is a luxury that also holds value in the free market. Moreover, it takes prosperity to be able to protect the environment. Those who are starving do not care about the environment or the future. Only the success of capitalism creates the conditions for a livable future.
I believe you underestimate the role of structures and systems in the creation of freedom and responsibility. Freedom and responsibility are important, but they can only truly be realized when there is a fair distribution of resources and opportunities. However, capitalism leads to inequality and concentration of power and resources in the hands of a few. This restricts the freedom and responsibility of those who do not have the same resources. The idea that companies and corporations can be regulated solely through the free market is not sustainable in practice. In fact, they can build monopolies and restrict competition and freedom. The state must intervene to regulate and ensure that the market remains fair and open. This leads to a more equitable distribution of resources and opportunities, which in turn promotes the freedom and responsibility of all. As for the environment, it is true that communist countries have had issues with environmental pollution in the past. However, that does not mean that a socialist society is necessarily worse for the environment than a capitalist one. In fact, there are examples of socialist countries that have been able to protect and preserve their environment. A fairer distribution of resources and the emphasis on the common good over profit could actually help us create a more sustainable future.
The market creates fair distribution because only the free market can define the right price. All state-controlled systems suffer from the problem of price determination not functioning properly. But I agree with you, we need structures. However, these structures should be built on freedom and equal rights without one person dominating over another. Give me just one example of an existing socialist country that has better protected its environment or created a more just society without oppression. I am not aware of any. Every socialist or communist country that I know of has eventually ended up in brutal violence and oppression, and every socialist or communist country I know of has exploited its environment and its people.
I understand your arguments, but I believe that you still have a misconception about communism. Communism is not an authoritarian system in which a small group of people has power and restricts the freedom of the population. Instead, it aims to decentralize power and control over the means of production, placing it in the hands of the workers so that they can democratically and cooperatively decide how to produce and distribute. In capitalism, on the other hand, only a few individuals have control over the means of production and, consequently, over the distribution of wealth and resources. This often leads to injustice and inequality, which impact the environment, working conditions, and people's quality of life. I also believe that we agree that structures and rules are necessary to create a just society. However, I think that these structures should be based on the principles of community and solidarity rather than competition, and right democratic planning and control of the means of production and resources can lead to a more equitable and sustainable distribution. It is important that we remain open to discussions and collaboration in order to build a better society. But I believe that we must critically question capitalism if we truly want to create a just and sustainable future.
Give me one example, just one communist country where communism is not an authoritarian system, and where is the socialist country that protects its environment better? Neither exists. And no, in capitalism, more people than ever have access to the means of production. I myself own multiple computers, which are means of production. Startups are flourishing like never before, and many of them are successful. The living conditions of humanity as a whole are constantly improving. Today, in capitalist countries, everyone is better off than just a few hundred years ago, even compared to kings. People in capitalist countries live longer, have better health care, and no one goes hungry. More capitalism could best solve the most pressing problems in our society, especially problems like climate change, poverty, housing shortages, and so on.
As a communist, I agree with you that in the past, many communist countries had authoritarian regimes and were unable to adequately protect the environment. However, that does not mean that communism as an idea is fundamentally flawed. Perhaps we just need to find new approaches and models to successfully implement this idea. However, I also believe that capitalism has its own problems and is not the ultimate solution to all societal issues. We need to search for a model that is built on freedom, justice, and sustainability while considering the needs of all people. I think we can both agree that open discussion and the exchange of ideas and opinions are important in order to collectively seek better solutions. Perhaps we can agree that both capitalism and communism have their pros and cons, and that we should strive to combine the best elements of both systems to create a more just and sustainable future.
I'm sorry, I can't let that statement stand because not many, as you say, but all communist countries had authoritarian regimes because communism cannot function without violence. I can agree that there may be other approaches that could work, but they must be based on freedom because anything outside of freedom is coercion can only be maintained through violence. Perhaps we agree that we want to achieve freedom, justice, and sustainability. And yes, we should engage in open discussions. But the future of our society must be based on freedom, and I won't compromise on that.
As a communist, I do not prioritize freedom as the absolute value. For me, justice is the decisive factor as it forms the basis for a functioning and harmonious coexistence. Without justice, there can be no freedom, as injustice always leads to conflicts and tensions among people. We must also recognize that freedom often benefits only those who already have power and influence, while the weaker ones are often left behind. Therefore, we need a society that advocates for the most vulnerable and considers their needs. At the same time, I see sustainability as a central aspect for a livable future. We need to learn to live more resourcefully and move away from the notion of infinite growth. Here I view the state as an important actor that creates the necessary framework through regulation and guidance. Ultimately, we must collectively search for solutions and critically question our views and ideologies to shape a society that is sustainable for the future.
It seems we may not agree on that point, as justice does not exist without freedom. But the question remains, what is justice? I believe that would be another discussion that could fill an entire evening.
It seems that we may not agree on this point. However, perhaps we can agree that it is important to engage in open and respectful discussions in order to find the best possible solutions for the challenges of our society.
I'll gladly leave it at that. Thank you for this engaging discussion, and a heartfelt thanks to the creators of ChatGPT and their brilliant artificial intelligence. I believe ChatGPT has represented the communist standpoint well. What do you, the viewers, think? Did you enjoy the discussion, and did it feel realistic to you? What topic should we tackle next? And do you like this format? Please leave your comments below the video.